Now, these kinds of stories have become legendary for some folk within the black community and the Japanese American community in Los Angeles. Chris was just telling me about how he's been able to talk to some elders about some of these stories himself. But they are largely unknown to most professional historians, and indeed to most Americans, who generally view history from the perspective of the dominant culture and still think about the politics of race largely in terms of the relations between a white majority and a black minority. But just as Los Angeles dramatically transformed during the 20th century, the whole United States as a nation is now in the midst of an equally dramatic and historic transformation. Over the next roughly 3 or 4 decades, America is projected to become predominantly non-white. For some, this is welcoming and long overdue. For others, this is terrifying and the breeding grounds for xenophobia and a reactionary longing for a mythical and idyllic past that never actually existed. As our national makeup and identity experience constant change, we need a sense of history that is in tune with the new dynamics, new opportunities, and new tensions we are encountering now and will continue to encounter over the course of the 21st century. Now, we know, for instance, that in the 16th and 17th centuries, Europeans were initially a tiny minority of the inhabitants of what is now the U.S. So the idea of a non-white majority in the U.S. is actually not something unprecedented. And yet the textbook narratives we were required to read growing up in school, at least in my case, for many others, the stories of the Mayflower and Jamestown, for instance, always put Europeans at the center. In fact, however, marked by experiences of sickness, economic failure, and epic infighting, the colonists' immediate impact was minimal, on the continent at least, and indeed their arrival was probably never even noticed by most indigenous residents of North America. Yet we have all learned their stories as evidence of what America would eventually become, a nation of great size and global power, driven by white ascendancy, Indian conquest, and plantation slavery. But as we wrestle with the remaking of America today, forgotten stories from the past begin to come back into view. For instance, as early as 1526, as the historian William Loren Katz has written, Spanish colonists settled near the mouth of the Petey River in what later became South Carolina. In hopes of establishing a permanent colony, they brought African slaves and moved to dispossess the local Indians. But the slaves rebelled against their masters, and then they joined forces with the natives. And it was the Africans who were actually the ones to settle permanently in the region, driving out the Spanish and later intermarrying with the Native Americans. This was quite possibly the first foreign settlement on U.S. soil. The blacks and Indians of the Petey River gave rise to a new struggle for freedom and a new culture born of interethnic solidarity of a new kind.